next speaker now. So Lucie Matthews-Jones. Do you want me to give any timing indications, or are you okay with your?
This next one's a bit of give some time because I'm not.
Which specifically? Do you want 5?
5 and
5, 7. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, over to you, Lucie.
Hey, thank you very much for coming to my paper, and it's been great being here. I'm a historian, so I don't in any way pretend to be a part of kind of like pedagogy discussions or networks. But what I really kind of have been increasingly interested is this idea of bringing creativity into the history classroom, in particular the higher education classroom. So if you had seen me at a recent faculty forum and I'd had my camera on, you would have seen that I was chopping up pieces of paper, fabric, thread, and even putting like needles in the corner and stuffing envelopes with the first initial of every student that was in my gender history module. And what I did is as a seminar activity, I decided that the students were going to sew this initial as they heard me read from a 19th century text. And they had themselves already done some reading about 19th century sewing and domesticity and gender identity. I would never have thought that this would be something that I would have done as a lecturer when I first started, and I've been teaching for now 15 years, and creativity has really informed the last 12 years of me being based at LJMU. And I love teaching. I think teaching is one of those spaces in higher education where I'm actually energized, where I really feel like I belong and I really feel a connection to my students. And I want them to feel that sense of excitement as well from their learning processes. So I've started to think far more about how we understand creativity, and in particular the idea of the micro-creative activity that happens within the classroom experience as a teaching method. And I've thought very much about this idea that Ashton and Stone have suggested, that creativity now enables people to be vibrant, dynamic, and unpredictable with process, that perhaps in some ways we're shifting the way in which knowledge is produced and ways of understanding to think more about how we can do things differently. And I think at the heart of this is really a reciprocal notion that actually the class should be transformed for both the lecturer and the student themselves. And it's really started to make me think far more about how actually, as I start to hone an identity for myself within higher education, I really want to do that through the parameters of being a creative historian. As this sort of discussion has already shown so far, I think history students sit at a distinct disadvantage. They often come from educational settings that are obsessed about knowledge production, fact recall, and of high elite skills around academic skills. So when they come into university, they're already very minded about what is good learning processes. And what I want to do is really kind of disrupt and kind of challenge actually what it is that a history classroom is doing. And how, in some ways, also personally for me as a lecturer, how do you continually stay in a system that doesn't invite innovation in your learning experience? Like, we're here for the long haul, and, you know, I've already done 15 years. How do I stay here for another 15 years? And creativity really sparks my excitement when it comes to the classroom, because I love creating lots of different activities. So my students in gender do scrapbooking, they make a tablecloth at the very end of the sessions, they make zines. It's very hands-on learning here. And I think this really invites us to think a little bit more about how we dismantle the idea of what it means to be historian academic, but also, as Jessamine Newhouse has recently discussed, this idea of bringing geekiness into our pedagogy, and actually how in some ways we're often incredibly geeky around knowledge, but we're also geeky in other ways. And it's really nice to actually show that kind of way of being to our students. And I really think it's interesting that when Jonathan was talking about this idea of pedagogy of kindness, about what does it mean to make a kind teaching space that we want students to inhabit and to belong to. So obviously for me, creativity is often aligned with artistic expression, but I use it as a way of thinking about making knowledge. So even through the process of making as being something that's made with hands, scissors and glue. But I also think there's a kind of fear around this idea of creativity, that it's a star moment, that you have to be really kind of artistic. But actually, I think my students have shown that it can be really empowering and very liberating for them. It also fits very much with this idea of creative thinking skills. and how through play and cultivating and creativity, we can actually start to see perhaps a more dynamic and exciting process of learning through what Resnick has described as the creative learning spiral, which invites students to imagine, create, play, share, reflect, and imagine again, rather than being forced to can tell the lecturer in front of them what it is that they think. And this fits for me, like if we're thinking about systems, it fits very much with what the QA benchmark is asking in history to show how creativity is a part of the programme. It's also a language that's being used now by employers, that they want to have creative skills demonstrated to them. But I also think more importantly, it's a way of trying to suggest that creative learning is about discussion, inquiry, collaboration and practice, and much less on the idea of acquisition and emphasis of learning content mastery. And I really want to kind of invite students to think more about how they're making knowledge and when they're in this space. And this is a very cramped classroom space. I've subsequently moved from this terrible room that the timetable gave me. But I would say I've always been interested in creativity. I'm a leader in history for the creative assessment. But I really started to reconsider what it was that I was asking students to do when they were being asked to do the creative assessment, and how I was putting my students at risk of having to develop creativity at the end of the module rather than infusing it throughout the whole process. So if we're talking about assessment process, I had to decide that they were already upskilled in that and I wasn't making that a part of their learning experience. But more importantly, I think it's really pushed me as an academic increasingly to rethink and reframe my teaching sessions and to consider how creativity is a small classroom act. And that is a radical act of that's built around hope. We haven't mentioned the pandemic, but one of the things I thought that was really interesting about the pandemic was our discussions about the screen and the blank black that we stared at, the silence. But one of the questions we never asked when we suggested that students had to come back to the classroom was, what type of classroom do I want them to come back to? And what was it about the classroom that has meant that we have seen attendance fall now that means students aren't coming back? And so I wanted to think far more about the physical space of the classroom and what was missing. And a recent study by the Royal Historical Society looking at higher education history students has shown that when it comes to their well-being, they talk a lot about happiness and belonging to their peers. And it made me realise that classroom spaces needed to be disrupted around this idea of what does a community of students look like. And I've also increasingly become more obsessed about this idea that what do I want? Participation in the classroom where they're talking with each other, where they're unpacking and unraveling what they think with each other, but through cutting up pieces of paper, or silence in which I stand in front of them asking and throwing out questions that they don't seem to want to answer. It also invites you to kind of reflect far more by what Kevin Gannon has talked with this feeling of radical hope, and that we have to centre our kind of moral and ethic imperatives as historians. I'm a disabled academic. I find it far more exciting to be creating these creative tasks, partly because I just simply cannot do the bulk of reading and the in-depth type of reading that's engaged with in these moments. So what I found with is I actually invited students last year to respond to a question about what has creativity done in the classroom in their student feedback. And what I found was the idea that the classroom space was animated, that far from seeing me as the authority in the classroom, they saw me as a friendly person who had a reciprocal relationship with me. And it also kind of encouraged them to think far more about embodied learning, but also remembering. They spoke about how by doing these creative activities, they remembered the points that were being made in the classroom, that it made them want to attend and to come and show up. And I found it really fascinating that whilst my colleagues were talking about how no one was attending their classes, my classes often had 90 to 100% attendance. It also invites them to consider informal types of historical sources that decenter and privilege the written Word document, like the biography or the book. So actually think about women's sewing practices, as the exercise earlier on did. And so when we did the sewing practice, we also had an 1830s life writing that had been sewn by a woman as a suicide note next door to get them to think far more about what it meant to be a working class woman. I recognise that creativity in the classroom isn't for everyone, and I don't think everyone should do it. I think vibrancy of class rooms should be kept and maintained. But the other side of it is that actually by honing into this idea of being a creative historian, I would say that I have actually started to be recognised far more within my subject area and within the institution. I've won national teaching awards through creativity, and it really kind of strikes at this idea that actually sometimes being radical is the thing that the institutions and your sector needs to be able to understand how to be dynamic and innovative and creative in your teaching. Thank you.
Questions? Yeah, Jeanette.
Absolutely.
Oh, thank you so much.
I am so impressed with the tenderness of creativity that you personally share with your students. I'm really inspired. You talked about the domesticity, and the domesticity of the sewing, and traditionally you would be the person who sewed in the family network. But do you see the students and activists, because you talked about activists this afternoon, I'm wondering, do your students see themselves as activists, or do you see them as activists? And just a final point is, how can the students gain some meaningful assessments in the creative journey that they share as historians?
Yeah. So the last question, for my level 6 module with Victorian Cities, they actually create a creative output. It's part of their assessment. And so I've had storybooks, I've had sewing projects, I've had card games, board games, diaries written from the perspective of the period, police notebooks. It's really exciting what they've produced. And in terms of student activists, what's really strange is this was the first year I've actually written down that creativity will form a part of their learning experience. And so I think that activists are making that choice to come into the classroom. And I also think that kind of transforming and disrupting, because gender history is typically understood to be not necessarily the serious part of history in the same way that, say, like political history is, like with the nation state centered. And so I found that really interesting. But the other side of it is that I think they also start to question their own assumptions, because when you think about sewing, you think, oh, that's really easy. Oh, that's feminine. That's all of this sort of thing. And yet the setting up the task, what's so interesting is hardly anyone knows how to sew. And they don't even know how to thread their needle or to take 2 threads out of the 6 threads that I give them. So I think it's also about shifting their understanding that actually women doing that stuff was twig, that there was a kind of radical act in sewing and homemaking.
Right, excellent. Well, many thanks.